welcome to this program. I'm Leanne Evans. I'm a volunteer at the Wilson County Historical Museum here in Fredonia, and one of my favorite things to do is to discover stories and also to share them. So that's what's going to be happening this afternoon. We're going to be talking about ghost towns of Wilson County, Guilford. Now, I should clarify, first of all, that a ghost town is defined as one that used to have a post office and no longer does. So that doesn't mean that nobody's living there. It doesn't mean that there's not a cultural life there. It simply means that the post office is gone. So in that regard and others, Guilford qualifies as a ghost town. I also want to tell you that most of the history that I'm going to tell you covers 50 years or less, which is really the period of time when Guilford was thriving, but I will not be covering what has happened really after 1925 to the next 100 years. I think lots of corn growing in that area, but beyond that, maybe not as much happening. Some of the sources of information that I used, a lot of it is newspaper accounts. The old newspapers had so much information. They really were the official record of the business of the county and the townships. They were also the Facebook of the day. So those old newspapers had a lot of Aunt Tilly went to visit Aunt Mabel. Didn't say if they got in a fight, but that's the sort of thing that was in the newspapers and was in, twice a week, and you'd hear about the comings and goings. And some of that does reveal a lot, because they quite often would say so-and-so's sick, and they would say what they were sick with, or they would mention a doctor's name that they had gone to. So you really can get a lot of information by looking at those newspapers and reading a lot. Those old newspapers are available free online, and if that's something you're interested in learning about how to do that, I can share that with you after the program. So, the Verdigris River was the source from which many settlements sprung during the post-Civil War years. Some flourished, others are now simply names, areas whose primary occupants are raising cattle. Guilford is such a place, a once-upon-a-time community that marks a certain geographic spot for many Wilson County residents of a certain age. The earliest history of Guilford goes back to May of 1861, when a gentleman named J.H. Gunby built the first cabin on the town site on the west side of the Verdigris River. He had intended to stay in the area, but instead sought shelter elsewhere when the Indians burned his cabin. Now, what is unfortunate, but the case in many, many areas throughout the Midwest of the United States, is that the recording of history began when white settlers came there, with little acknowledgement of what the Native Americans' history was in that location, other than when they were removed from that area. So this is kind of an example of that. We know that Mr. Gundy built a cabin and left. Now, what precipitated the Indians burning his cabin, that part of the story we don't know. In 1865, the Civil War terminated, and then a treaty was made with the Indians in the fall. Many settlers then began moving in, all locating on those precious bottom claims. So we see that Guilford Township was organized, and the Guilford Post Office opened the same year that Fredonia was organized. So right at the end of the Civil War, a lot was happening in this area. Here we see a township map from 1881, and I want to point out a couple of things to you. Here's Guilford Township. Here's Clifton Township. Verdigris Township is kind of this L-shaped. Clifton and Colfax above it. Here we have Prairie, Pleasant Valley with Guilford in between. We go to about 30 years later. Here's Guilford Township with Prairie and Pleasant Valley on either side. Here's Clifton Township. Verdigris Township is now rectangular because now we have Webster Township, which was created partly out of verdigris and partly out of the Clifton. So going back to the 1881, we see the post office was created. Here is the verdigris winding through. Here's Crooked Creek. And we have some roads, but not a whole lot. So not very much defined on this map. We go to the next one, 30 years later. Now we see, here's Guilford, here's Benedict Junction, the Verdigris River. Now we have a railroad. Actually, we have two railroads intersecting at Benedict. And that fact looms very large in the history of Guilford. You can see a notation here of a school there. There's a school there. There's a school. Up here, east of Benedict, we have a church and a school. So on these township maps, those structures were noted. And here we see a side-by-side comparison of those, and you see how the place really in those 30 years has built up. October 8, 1868, Guilford Township was defined and created. F. Davis from Iowa was the first settler, and this was not counting Mr. Dundee, locating in 1858 on the Verdigris River, just west of the present town of Benedict, and was then lower down the river than any other settler. So he settled there pre-Civil War, pre the end of the Civil War. Other early settlers in the township included Moses Davis, John Circle, Alex Elder, John Carter, John G. Weinbright, William Sutton, T.C. and S.M. Singleton, S.S. Benedict, Frank Farwell, Alex Scheuer, H.T. Amston, William Ball, and others who took claims prior to or during 1865. In the fall of 1867, after a treaty had been made with the Indians, Andrew Aiken and his two sons, Carlos and Charles, settled on what was to become the town site and erected a sawmill. So here we see really information about where the name of Guilford came from. This photo is Guilford, New York, where Andrew Aiken came from. And we see from this little graphic where Guilford is located in New York, and it still is a town that exists there. So this followed the pattern of many small communities where whoever established the post office would name the town after the town that they came from, they immigrated from. Here we see photos of Aiken Mill, Aiken's Mill, the flour mill. The Verdigris River was dammed and the Aiken Mill constructed in 1870. George and Sam Bender, considered fine stonemasons, built the dam using George Brown's 22-pound sledgehammer. And I don't know much about sledgehammers other than I don't want to use one, but my husband tells me that a 22-pound sledgehammer is a pretty good size one. So George and Sam Bender must have been pretty amazing physical specimens. Charlie Sprague was the first miller. After the dam was built, the sawmill was moved over next to the grist mill on the east side of the river. Joe Taylor, seeing an opportunity to make money, built a small rowboat and ferried passengers for 10 cents across the river. The Verdigris River has long been a source of recreation, a great spot for picnics. So when I look at a photo like this, I always look at how they are dressed. I wouldn't want a picnic in the summer in that getup. The unique position near the exact center of the county led Guilford residents in 1869 to campaign as the county's seat designation. It was then a 2-year-old community with a sawmill mill and grist mill alongside the breweries, the post office and store, about the same as any other upstart town site on the high prairie. Guilford's location, northwest of Fredonia on the river, was said to be 1 3/4 miles from the geographic center of Wilson County, thus prompting the residents to rally to be the county seat. The race of 1869 included Fredonia, Coyville, and Verde, another community lost to changing times. And Guilford received 115 votes, not enough to be declared the winner. Fredonia won the election in June 1868 and was officially deemed the county seat on April 3, 1869. Those of you that know quite a bit of Wilson County history may know that the designation of Fredonia as the county seat took going all the way to the Kansas Supreme Court to be decided. But that is a story for another day. Despite the loss of what could have brought new life to the little community, Guilford continued to grow, and by 1870 had 2 stores, a saloon, wagon maker, carpenter, blacksmith, a doctor, and a lawyer. Obviously, the flooding of the Verdigris River, which could be a shallow stream one day and a raging torrent the next, prompted Luke Brooke to open his store on the east side of the river in 1870. This photo is showing the old Wilson County courthouse, the old one, several renditions ago. Same location, I believe, as the current courthouse, but certainly as prior to the grand one that preceded what we have now. In April of 1870, John S. Gilmore, on the advice of one of his friends, brought the first job printing press to Wilson County, establishing the Guilford Citizen, the 3rd newspaper in the area, and the forerunner of present-day Wilson County Citizen in Fredonia. The paper was published upstairs over one of the dry goods stores. George Brown, according to his son Brooke, made the first inking board for the paper. In October of 1870, Gilmore suspended his paper at Guilford, moving to Neodesha and establishing the Neodesha Citizen, and finally to Fredonia, where it became the Wilson County Citizen. The first issue of the Guilford Citizen contained a glowing description of the town site, encouraging all to settle in the area. And as many newspaper accounts of that time they really may have glossed over any difficulties that were existing in the area and made it sound just like the absolute best place to move. But it does give a good description of the area and the assets, natural and otherwise, that were in the area. So this was John Gilmore's article. Having recently laid off 60 acres on the east bank of the Verdigris River as an addition to the town site of Guilford, Wilson County, Kansas, making it in all about 160 acres of the richest and choicest land to be found in southern Kansas. The best of water is sure to be found at a depth of from 20 to 25 feet without striking rock. The most valuable timberlands are in the immediate vicinity of town, along the valley above and below. A fine quality of white limestone for building purposes, easily cut or broken, is to be found near the summit of the bluffs in inexhaustible quantities and ease of access. The river is fordable at all seasons of the year with ease and perfect safety, except at flood time. The ford is undoubtedly the best, and the banks of easier grade than any other on the Verdigris River in Wilson County. All the main roads running south from Burlington, Leroy, Neosho Falls, Iowa, and Humboldt center here and cross this ford. The lands upon which the town is located are now deeded, and the proprietors are enabled to make to purchasers of lots warranty deeds and perfect titles. Lots are of large size, being 50 by 140 feet, bounded by streets 80 and alleys 20 feet in width. The proprietors offer to give lots free of charge to parties who will build on and improve them from 1 to 10, according to the value and kind of improvements. They will donate valuable building sites to the different denominations of Christians for church purposes, also for schools and other religious or literary institutions. They would especially invite all kinds of mechanics to come here and establish themselves and their business on free soil. Lots will be given to those building shops as well as dwellings. So the concept of giving incentives to businesses that will move to a community is not a new concept. We talk about and sometimes are aggravated by tax abatements that are given to businesses, but they've been doing it for well over 100 years. Well-regulated district schools are established here, having a public fund sufficient to pay first-class teachers 3/4 of the year. Religious meetings are held here regularly on the Sabbath days. And it goes on and on. Guilford, a wonderful place to move to. Well, there were people that moved there and settled the area. Here we see a 1910 property ownership surrounding Guilford. We see the town of Guilford right here. Here's the vertebrates. By 1910, here's the railroad. Over here we see Altoona Portland Cement. So the cement plant, North Altoona Cement Plant, was right here on the other side of the river. You will see names on the property ownerships in 1910 that some are very familiar. That this is ownership that is still within the family. Here we have Farwell land in 1910, so over 100 years ago. In some of what I will mention, it will talk about Ruggles, property that Ruggles owned, kind of in this area. Also, A.Z. Brown. I don't know if Singleton and Benedict owned property at that time, but they will be names that I will mention in the future. Common names of those early days: Aiken, Farwell, Morse, Ruggles, Sprague, Benedict, Singleton, Vaughn, Short, and Gilmore. Of course, Gilmore was here for a very short time. The museum has a collection of photographs of some of the homes, and we see Charles Sprague's home, the Morse home, Ponser home, Andy Bloom home. I can't say for sure that all of these were in Guilford itself, but certainly were in the area. Here we have the plat of the town of Guilford. We see Center Street right here. This was Mill Street. And then we have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Street. And this is Ruggles land on this side, Seckler land to the north, Sprague land to the east. And here is, of course, the bend in the river. We're very fortunate to that Don Vaughn shared this view of the valley, of the Guilford Township Valley, and I think it's just marvelous topographical depiction. We see the bluffs right here on the east side of the river, valley, lowland here along the river, bluffs on this side. The town of Guilford was right here. Some of the identifiers would be, let's see, the town of Guilford, right there. Guilford School was here. First we have Crooked Creek going there. Buttermilk Hill, and we'll be talking about Buttermilk Hill a little bit more. James Perkins Vaughn had a home in this area, and I believe that is John Vaughn's grandfather. Did I get that right? Great-grandfather, okay. So let's talk about Buttermilk Hill. Buttermilk Hill has been a Wilson County landmark for more than 100 years. According to Marion Vaughn, an early day settler lived on the upland, south and west of town of Guilford. One day, the family set out for Guilford with a can of sour cream in the wagon. They had to go down a long and very rough hill, and when getting to the foot, they examined the sour cream in the can and found buttermilk instead, thus the name Buttermilk Hill. Now, having been down Buttermilk Hill just a couple of days ago, if I had had sour cream in my car, I might have had buttermilk down at the end of the bottom. It's still not fabulously rated. Let's talk about the post office. The post office at Guilford was established July 23, 1868, with Andrew Aiken as the first postmaster. What followed for the next 40 years was not consistent service to the community. At one point, it was the postmaster himself who caused a change, and this newspaper account tells the story. This account was in the Wilson County Citizen, October 11, 1895. It's headlined, "Guilford Post Office No More." The department at Washington has summarily discontinued the Guilford Post Office. It is presumed that the nearness of the office to Benedict and other places and its minor importance induced this step. This office was temporarily suspended because the postmaster, W.K. Morse, thought Washington was over-rigid in respect to his performance of duties. And he defiantly addressed the department a letter declaring that it could take the Guilford Post Office and enact an impossible feat with it. I'll let you use your imagination on that one. After a while, the office was reestablished, its mail interim going to Greystone. And I believe that in July of 1908, the post office was permanently moved to Benedict, where C.A. Sprague was postmaster. So in 1908, not only did the post office move, but C.A. Sprague, who had a store, moved. So Guilford at that time was on the wane, and Benedict was on the rise. Rivers are generally considered an asset due to the water source and the industry that forms along it. But if you can't cross it, the river can be a frustration. The subject of bridging the Verdigris River started early, but it was not until 1887 that an iron bridge was built. It remained in service until January 19, 1972, when its deteriorating condition warranted closing. A new concrete bridge with steel beams was built upstream, and the old iron bridge removed in 1983. The low water bridge also provided access directly across the Verdigris. Let's talk about the railroad. This map of the railroad, I believe, is from 1912 or 1915. And what you're looking at is various colors denoting the different railroads. So green is the Missouri Pacific. This will be the track that we're most interested in today. The yellow was the St. Louis and San Francisco. And the red was the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. And we see it really crisscrosses the county. In 1886, the Missouri Pacific and Santa Fe railroads were constructed through Guilford Township. And at their intersection, the town of Benedict was surveyed in May of 1886. The town started most promisingly with stores, shops, hotel, livery stable, beautiful residences, comfortable cottages, and its people supplied with natural gas for heating and lighting. Both Benedict and Guilford had depots in 1887. Over the years, there was some closing and reopening of the depot at Guilford with accompanying petitions and misunderstanding. Both Guilford and North Altoona depots were discontinued in 1927. I have been unable to determine where a depot might have been, and it may just have been a flag stop at Guilford. I have heard anecdotally that there were stockyards adjacent to the railroad and the railroad stop. I've not had verification in that in print, but it certainly would make sense. And certainly with all of the cattle industry in the area, if they were going to move their cattle, they would very likely benefit from stockyards just adjacent to the railroad depot. Here's a very old photograph of the train near Guilford. I would love to know exactly where that is, but I think that's an amazing photograph. What I know here, one of the things I know here is the hedge posts for the fencing, and I have come across newspaper accounts of gentlemen in the area who cut timber specifically for hedge posts and perhaps even planted the hedge trees for that purpose. Guilford's first village was on the west side of the river, and it was there Samuel Morse opened a log store in 1869. The store housed dry goods, groceries, hardware, a saloon, and a post office. Morse had a fine peach orchard adjacent to his business. Luke Brooke promoted a similar store on the east side in 1870. P.I.B. King, a Civil War veteran, had come to Guilford in early 1868, opening his law office, and he was elected county attorney that year. In 1872 or 73, he moved to Girard. King's full name was Peru Italian Blackerby King. If that was my name, I would go by P.I.B. also. Additional businesses included a law office, doctor's office, printing office, shoe shop, blacksmith shop, the Guilford House Hotel, and a snake antidote resort, all built in 1870. In 1870, Bender and Grubb had a brickyard at the base of Buttermilk Hill. So here we have a list of a number of the businesses that there were. Here's the proprietor of the Guilford House Hotel. There's a stage line, wagon making. When you go down the list, you see that much of what you would need to make a living, to provide for your family, was there in that community. I mentioned Charles Sprague, and he sold his store to a D.C. Luganville. And we have a picture of that store when Luganville opened that, or when he owned that. It doesn't look to me like these two are the same stores. I think the photographs that we've shown of stores are probably three different properties, but that's a little bit difficult to determine. The Guilford Nursery, established in 1869 by George E. Brown, operated for many years and was well known in the area for the quality of their stock. His daughter, Winifred Brown Curtis, documented the history of the nursery as well as much of the history of Guilford in her 1953 book, Growing Up with Kansas. At one time, years ago, the Wilson County Citizen copied a number of sections of, they printed a number of sections of that book. And I was just thrilled when I found that the museum actually had a copy of her book, and it was so hard for me to put down. I thought it was just fascinating because she was telling first person what happened when her family moved there. She went to Gravel Hill School. She talks about the nursery and how they got it, her father got it started. She tells snake stories. She just tells lots of interesting stories. And while we're not able to loan that book out, if you would like to come to the museum and spend some time there reading it, I would be happy to share that with you. I think you would find it interesting as well. So where was the Guilford Nursery? So here we have Guilford. This is the 1881 map. And these old maps are really informative because, as I said, you'll see school and cemetery right here. That's Gravel Hill. This says school, and that would be the Guilford School. And look at this little right here and here, here. Those are orchards. Those are orchards. So anytime you see that symbol on the map, you know that's an orchard. So when we talk about the Guilford Nursery, even if it didn't have that label there, I would know by the property ownership and that symbol that that's where that was. Just a couple of notes from newspaper accounts. This was in the Citizen in September of 1875. The Brown family of the Guilford Nursery intend making 5 or 6 barrels of wine this fall from the Concord grapes. So they did supply a variety of growing things, not just trees. Then in 1876, a year later, we would mention in this connection the fact that Brown Brothers of the Guilford Nursery have the choicest nursery stock in this section of Kansas. They have been established over 6 years, and their nursery is the place to get anything in the line of trees, shrubs, and vines. They have thrown out all inferior stock and guarantee the character and thriftness of everything they sell. Their stuff is Kansas grown, and all varieties have been tested in this soil and climate, and only such plants as are best adapted are propagated and grown in their nursery. And it goes on. In the book that Winifred wrote, she tells about the grafting of the trees and how they did that. And that was really a family production event that took place, and how they stored those grafts through the winter. Lots of details there. Keep in mind that stock like this that they were growing got shipped outside of the area. People were shipping goods not just to Fredonia, but there were some notations of goods being shipped to Chicago, Kansas City. So access to the railroad is key if you want to ship anything. The agriculture in the area, of course, cattle, grain, lumber, and there was a notation in a newspaper account of walnut lumber being shipped to Chicago, the nursery, and there's also an account of honeybees being raised and honey produced. Cattle ranching and grain harvesting were major industries. T.C. Singleton and S.S. Benedict were 2 large ranchers, both of whom had homes outside of the area for when the summer weather became inhospitable. And of course, not every grain farmer would have their own threshing machine. That was often a community event. And here we see Clark Offenbacher with his threshing machine and Lynn Morse on the machine. Well, there was never a church building built in Guilford. There certainly was religious activity. The newspaper in 1876 brought news of the first quarterly meeting of the Coyville Circuit Preacher, scheduled for May 21st. The Sunday school had been established with regular attendance of about 50 persons. Reverend Staples of Altoona was another minister who occasionally conducted services in Guilford. It seems that religious fervor varied over time, as noted in the following newspaper's account. In 1882, we are in favor of anything of a religious nature, but it does seem useless to attempt to have Sunday school, preaching, or anything of that character in Guilford, as the attendance of such services rarely exceeds a half dozen persons. Now, this notation was in July, and we know how hot it is in July, so hear that. Then in January of 1891, about 9 years later, the biggest kind of a religious revival has been going on at Guilford for some weeks. Some of the worst sin-steeped worldlings have undergone conversion and are foremost among the advocates of the gospel and its spirit. A subscription paper to secure funds wherewith to build a church has been circulated in that vicinity, and a large sum pledged. Some of the subscribers signed for $75 or $100 each. One of the best country church buildings in the county will probably be erected at Guilford the coming season. Well, that didn't happen. In 1901, an effort will be made at Guilford next Sunday afternoon to organize a Sunday school. So it was very much up and down. And while the reasons for the difficulties maintaining a formal religious community over time may vary, certainly a lack of church structure was not an indication of the spiritual inclinations of individuals and families. So we need to watch our assumptions about their spiritual life. Education. Well, we know that there were 5 schools in Guilford Township. Guilford School, District 66, closed in 1934. Gravel Hill was west of Guilford, District number 15, and it consolidated with Benedict in 1920. Benedict, of course, was District 53. Baker Valley, south of Guilford, District 86. And for a time, there was a school in North Altoona, across the river, District 104. Here we have the Guilford School class. The date is unknown, but I do believe there are some Vaughns in there. Not sure of the other names, but those are some I'm aware of. And this is a photograph taken in, let's see, I think 1965 of that schoolhouse. The building was purchased by Lynn Morse and moved to his farm from Mrs. Short's farm. In Gravel Hill, we know that there was a cemetery behind the school. At Guilford, now this was a notice in 1902 citizen. At Guilford, there's talk of combining the 3 school districts that corner there and building a good schoolhouse with 3 or 4 rooms that they may have a graded school. Each district is in need of a new building, and neither district has a number of pupils sufficient to make a good school alone. The Buffalo Advocate newspaper says meetings are being held to decide the matter, and if agreed upon, the building of a new house at Guilford, which is central, will soon begin. Later, consolidation was defeated. In the early 1870s, the settlers at Guilford were periodically plagued by disease. The editor of the Guilford Citizen noted that many of the lowland farms had to be abandoned because of the ague and malaria that took a heavy toll in sickness and death every year. So remember I said that the Singleton and Benedict owned homes. I know Singleton for sure owned a home here in Fredonia, and so being out on the farm with all the mosquitoes and everything else going on during the summer, that was not a good place to be in. They would definitely be in Fredonia during the summer, or at least the wife and family would be. Each spring, the paper carried advertisements offering quinine and other ague remedies for sale. The sickness was seasonal and was apparently taken for granted, considering that each year the arrival of the plague was ushered in by one of the local editors printing the annual joke proclaiming that, quote, the ague was here and willing to shake. The disease was so prevalent that those who could afford it bought or rented upland farms and moved during the hot, wet months, staying away from the bottoms except to plant and harvest their crops. This small annoyance did little to hamper Guilford's boom, as in 1870, the editor of the Citizen counted no fewer than 10 immigrant wagons a day rolling toward the homes in the southern part of the county. Most of the time, Guilford had medical services. T.L. Craig was one of the early doctors. In the February 2, 1883 issue of the Citizen, there was this item. Dr. T.L. Craig of Guilford has received a government appointment as physician for the Osage Indians and will move to the agency in about 2 weeks. This leaves Guilford without a doctor. It is rumored that Dr. Hallpeter of New Albany will locate in Guilford. Appears that there was a pharmacist locally. Dr. Maxim was a dealer in drugs and medicine. Well, due to the rocky nature of the area, snakes found Guilford Township a desirable home. By 1870, an enterprising individual established a snake antidote resort. I don't know what that is, but I don't want to go. Now, I mentioned that Winifred Brown Curtis has written this book, and I want to share a little bit of the snake account. as if we were intruders in their territory, and they were trying to scare us away. I was not nearly as afraid of them then as I am today. There were so many places a snake could go that were not realized before we really got acquainted with them. Blue, bull, and rattlesnakes predominated in our locality. Father protected the bull snakes because they ate mice, rats, and rabbits, all of which were a menace to our property. When I look back on pioneer days, I can recall many snake stories, some of which stand out. I had explained earlier that at first there were wide cracks in the walls of our clay shanty due to the shrinking of the drying green lumber. This permitted snakes to enter. One day, Father stretched out on the red carpet for his usual noon rest. He went to sleep with his head right near one of those cracks. A little slow-spoken neighbor boy happened to be in the room. After bed, he came to Mother and very slowly and calmly said, "Mrs. Brown, there is a snake sticking its head up by Mr. Brown's head." Mother, the little wicked she was, made one jump, grabbed Father by the feet, and pulled him back, of course, away. He at once jumped up and killed the visiting snake, which turned out to be a rattler. And she does have more snake stories than that one. So I can imagine why Mrs. Singleton and others would be happy to move to town for the summer season. Well, of course, there were deaths in the area. Some accounts indicate that the Osage Indians had a graveyard at Singleton's Ford on the east bank of the Verdigris in the early days. And we know that there was a cemetery adjacent to Gravel Hill School. The Glenwood or Winebright Cemetery is located about 1 mile east of Guilford on land owned at one time by Mose Cox. It is situated at the edge of a woods that borders his meadow. There is no access road to the cemetery. There is an account of, during one flood, of coffins floating down the river and ending up at Altoona, and those were reported to be from the Winebright Cemetery. It appears that the locations of these burial grounds are not all clearly identified, marked, and maintained. We suspect that there are unmarked graves as well. So there's work to be done to honor those whose earthly remains lie in the Guilford area. In the spring of 1874, the Aiken brothers, original settlers of Guilford, were drilling for water near the mill pond at their sawmill, and this newspaper account documents the events of the day. And it is really proof that you don't know what you don't know until you know it. Here's the account. On Wednesday, May 27th, the usual quiet and repose of the village of Guilford was startled by a report scarcely excelled by a heavy cannon and followed by a violent shaking of the earth. On visiting the mill pond of Aiken and Brothers, where a party of well diggers were drilling for water, the cause of the shock became evident. The gentlemen engaged in drilling a well on the premises of the above, having reached the depth of 120 feet, all at once noticed the drill descend about 6 inches, evidently meeting with no obstructions, and at once a deep rumbling sound like heavy thunder came forth from the well and drove the person who was tending the drill to the surface. Having reached the top, the drill was immediately withdrawn, but no water became visible. The drill was again lowered and a few strokes given, but the noise became so terrific that all operations were suspended. A slight odor was emitted from the well, and the conclusion that something inflammable was escaping induced the gentleman to test its burning qualities. You know what's coming, don't you? A match was at once lighted on the edge of the well and had hardly commenced to burn when the report and shock that has been described took place, and the adventurous well digger with whiskers, eyebrows, and hair missing lay at some distance from the well, evidently meditating upon the peculiarity of combustibles. A solid column of flame shot up from the well at least 40 feet and continued to burn, attending with that same rumbling sound that at first indicated the presence of something escaping from the well. At last, burned brightly until extinguished by the heavy rain on Sunday night, no water of any quantity has appeared. The noise has ceased, and the usual quiet again reigns around. Well, apparently, it never occurred to anyone that what they had found, natural gas, might be more valuable than the water they were looking for. And this accidental natural gas discovery was never noted in an early history of Wilson County that was published in 1902. So it took a while for gas and oil to really be acknowledged and recognized in that area. There were some attempts in the 1890s to drill oil wells, but they were not deemed successful and profitable. The newspapers were full of accounts of somebody drilling a well and at first being very optimistic and then going dry, but attempts continuing to be made, and some drilling of gas wells and some of oil wells. According to Dorothy Morrison, a field at the bottom of Buttermilk Hill, which ran north toward the old bridge, at one time had many oil wells. After the wells ran out, some Eastern entrepreneurs visited the area searching for oil. Upon hearing of their interest, the enterprising man who owned the land hired young boys to place oil around the dry wells and in various places on the ground, rather like salting a gold mine. The unsuspecting Easterners bought the mineral rights and afterwards found out that all the oil was gone. Well, in 10 to 15 years, that changed, and in 1903, the Wilson County Citizen stated that the air is so full of gas in our vicinity that it is not safe to light a match outside the house. Within a few years, there were visions of enough gas to supply cement and brick plants at Guilford with a gas well bought by the Altoona smelter plant. In 1907, the Citizen stated, "There's prospect of an early inauguration of drilling operations for gas along Birdgrass in the vicinity of Benedict and Guilford. No one cares for oil. It's gas that is valued, being sought because there is either an existing demand for its use or a certain future use which prompts its purchase." Production and profits continued, and in 1917, the Citizen noted, "Guilford is still there, and the oil field is still on the boom. 3,600 barrels of oil are being shipped out every day, and new wells are coming in almost every day." Well, of course, industry in the area would need supply of fuel, and I'm sure that was a factor in the North Altoona cement plant development. And while I won't be telling the whole story, I think it does bear at least mentioning that this cement plant on the bluff across the river had an impact on the Guilford area. Victor Buechner and his family moved to the Guilford area to construct and manage a new business, the North Altoona cement plant to the east of the Verdigris River. While the cement plant and the Buechner home, later called the Castle, were being built, the Buechners lived in tents with cement floors. The plant opened in 1909, and the Buechners moved into their unusual home. The castle was built on a cliff overlooking the railroad and the Verdigris River. The lower floor consisted of a large dining room with a ceiling 2 stories high. In the center of this room hung a huge chandelier. In one of the bedrooms, there was a built-in bed with high bedposts and a sunken bathtub. The 7 fireplaces, each different, supplied the heat for the house. Short sets of stairways, which led from room to room, could be found here and there throughout the house, which made it hard to figure out which floor you were on. The castle also had a wine cellar, and it was thought there was a covered tunnel leading from the castle to the Verdigris River. castle was compared to German castles and had beautiful wall tapestries and furniture to show the Buettners' wealth. During the years Victor Buettner was manager of the cement plant, there were rumors of him being a German spy with the job of keeping track of food and troops on the railroad in that area. Somewhere around the start of World War I, Victor and his family disappeared and the cement plant closed. There are many different stories of his spy activities and death, but we don't know if any of them are correct. Newspaper accounts from that time had a little bit of back and forth between various editors about, was he a spy, was he not a spy, people defending him. We certainly know that during wartime it's a time of heightened emotions, which sometimes drive rumors, so we don't know is basically the bottom line. The Guilford area was not immune to criminal activity of various kinds. In 1872, bandits and robbers also found Guilford a good place to ply their trade. Our county, wrote the editor of the Citizen, during the last 10 days has been infested with a gang of horse thieves who have displayed a boldness in their operations which is rarely to be met with, even among those long-haired, hemp-deserted scoundrels. The travelers stayed for a short while, stealing horses and creating havoc wherever they went. They were run out of town eventually, and things returned somewhat to normal. But most notably, in October of 1872, Constable A.G. Lohman was killed by Alonzo Snodgrass. And we have an account of that event, and it's just so telling of the period of time in so many ways that I want to share parts of that with you. Over in Guilford Township, October 1872, a man by the name of Snodgrass was reported to have beaten his wife most cruelly. He was coarse, surly, and brutal, and was a drunkard. He was described in the jail calendar sheriff's office book as being 5 feet 8 inches, fair with black hair and blue eyes. Snodgrass was arrested by A.G. Lohman, the township constable. A. Gilmore Lohman, who had settled in Guilford in 1869, was a bachelor. He ran a hack from Humboldt to Fredonia in 1870, and in 1870 to 71 drove a hack from Guilford to Neodesha. Lohman was well liked by most everyone. So when you have questions about, well, how do people get from place to place, they hired a hack. They hired somebody with a horse and wagon or a horse and buggy of some sort. Lohman took Snodgrass to Altoona, and there the constable placed Snodgrass in an unoccupied store building. Snodgrass's hands were tied for some time, and Lohman, a kind, generous man, untied the lawbreaker's hand. In the room were the weights of a pair of grocer's scales, which Snodgrass got in his possession. He hurled the heaviest one at Lohman with such great force, the constable, being struck on the head, was knocked senseless. Snodgrass escaped to Neodesha, where he stayed a day and a night, intoxicated, and slept in Phillips and Klinger's livery stable. Doctors Craig of Guilford and Willits of Fredonia were called to Altoona to attend Lohman's injuries. The young constable's skull had been shattered, and the doctors performed the operation called trephining. The trephine was a type of small crown saw used in surgery to remove circular discs of bones from the skull. Craig and Willits removed about 1.5 inch square bone from Lohman's skull. Snodgrass was arrested on suspicion in Independence. Wilson County Sheriff Captain B.W. Ladd brought him to Fredonia to the county jail. Marshal A. Gilmore Lohman died October 29, 1872. Snodgrass was bound over to the next term of district court at a preliminary trial held November 17 of that year. His bond was set at $5,000. Although jailbreaks were common in those days, the one which Snodgrass successfully performed certainly was an unusual one. The county jail at that time was divided by means of iron bars placed 6 inches apart in 2 compartments.
The space back of the grating were the cells, and the other part of the jail was used for other purposes and contained a stove. This is not the building that is currently where the museum is housed. This was a prior jail, I believe, in that same location. Snodgrass on Sunday night, November 18, or Monday morning, November 19, picked the lock of the partition door, and thus being able to get to the stove, took fire therefrom and burned a hole in the roof, the aperture large enough for him to escape. Monday night, Sheriff Ladd and Deputy Barrett, accompanied by R.T. Taylor Altoona, widened their search and arrived in the O'Shea in hot haste after Snodgrass. They stayed only long enough to eat and feed their horses, then rode on south toward Independence. Apparently, Snodgrass made good his escape, for following accounts do not record his capture. The authorities thought at the time he would head south to Indian Territory and on to Texas. So, while what I have shared with you so far about the building up of Guilford and businesses and thriving activity in that area is all of the good things, this certainly still was a rather wild period of time where there was criminal activity going on. There were also many cultural and community events happening in the Guilford area. In the early days, Guilford had a very active community life with many social events, often held at Sprague Hall or Guilford School. On the second floor of Sprague Hall, it was kind of an open area as I understand it, and so there were programs and dances and things like that up there. These included lyceum events, literary society, ice cream socials, oyster suppers as fundraisers, picnics, boating excursions, dances, a baseball team, wolf hunts, and political debates. One thing that intrigues me is that when the railroads came to the area, there were now products available and foods available that would not otherwise be available, and one of those was oysters. And having recently had an oyster, I'm just not sure if they shipped them on ice. It would appear from some of these accounts that these were fresh oysters. But I know that an oyster doesn't last too long if it's not on ice, so I have questions. There was strong political activity in this area, and I believe Singleton and Benedict were both politicians. But this was an active area, and there were political debates. I do believe that it was a largely Republican area, but certainly there was a lot of conversation about society and government. There was also in this area, not specifically in the town of Guilford, but in the area, the old settlers reunion happened. And this was in Singleton's Grove. Here's an old photograph from way back. And the museum has records of the old settlers that attended each year. They would sign the book, and we have some of those books. But these were the original pioneers, the original settlers, and they would come together, and these events would provide opportunities for those pioneers to reminisce, to celebrate how they overcame hardships, and how they built a life in this new country. The rapid development of other large towns in the area, such as Fredonia and Benedict, caused Guilford to decline, and in 1876 the site was partially vacated by the legislature. As a further blow, in May of 1886, the Missouri Pacific and Santa Fe Railroads intersected at the site of the town of Benedict, which had already been surveyed. The post office at Guilford and most of the buildings were moved to Benedict, 4 miles northwest of Guilford in 1888 and 1889. Some say that by 1899, Guilford was on the decline. The Citizen of June 5, 1908 says, "The town of Guilford is threatened with dissolution. Dr. T.L. Craig has moved his drugstore from Guilford to Benedict. It is said that the post office at Guilford will soon be discontinued and a new office established at Benedict. Charlie Sprague has started a branch store at the town and the railroad crossing and will soon move all his goods there. And then in 1913, there was this account. It would kill the town of Guilford to have that depot moved. So we say, let it stay where it is. We presume Guilford will soon put in waterworks and a trolley line to carry the people to the cement plant. The summer of 1917 brought an anticipated building boom with an item in the gas gulch column in the Altoona Tribune. And during the time of the gas and oil boom, these newspapers would have a specific column where the gas and oil news could be found in the newspaper, and it was usually called the gas gulch column. The city of Guilford, for many years somewhat dead, is now on the way, and soon there will be a large eating house built for accommodation of the oil drillers and the public. There is talk of a refinery being built at Guilford. Sam Ruggles has a large fish pond at the edge of town, and the place could be made into a pleasure resort. This anticipated building boom in 1917 that would breed renewed longevity into the town never materialized. By the late 1920s, the only business left in Guilford was the blacksmith shop owned by David Ponser. All of Guilford's early enterprises are gone, and what has not returned to native vegetation is now under cultivation. A recent visit to the area revealed fields of newly harvested wheat, young soybean plants, and lush fields of tall corn. Today, the only reminders of the once vibrant community life in Guilford are Buttermilk Hill, the nearby railroad with its trains that pass through without stopping, and the river itself. And of course, the people who continue to tell the stories that keep Guilford alive. Thank you. Many of you have some information that you would like to share about your experiences in Guilford or your knowledge. Now would be a great time to do that. I would like a show of hands of those of you that live in Guilford, in Guilford Township, have ancestors from Guilford Township. So, I know Don Vaughn does, this gentleman up here does. Are there others that are close to that area and have something they'd like to share? Well, I will leave you to share it with each other after I turn the microphone off. Unless, Mr. Vaughn, you have something you'd like to share? Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming here, and thank you for your interest in history and your interest in Guilford. I'm not a native of Wilson County, but I have really come to love this place where I've chosen to live, and love the stories that there are about the people who settled this country.